Welcome back to another episode of Wrestling with Memories. You are joined by me, Wax the Brain Hussein, and Fash, the $1 Million Fan. Fash, how you doing? How are those nuts?
Well, you're used to having nuts, but I'm having the ones that you actually eat. All good. I'm living the $1 Million lifestyle as always, Wax. And we're back. We're not going to skip any more shows, though even this has been a chore once again. You and your big ego. You're away on holiday yet again after having the world's longest break. You're away somewhere far. You're celebrating a landmark 10-year anniversary. So I've had to rope you in to do another show after we promised everyone. So, all this, you make the TikTok videos, you make all these, smart tweets, but when it comes to work, this is the first time why I walked out in this organization, and I was promised that you would shape up. But like the elite, you're a bit of a waste of space. But, other than I'm good. I'm good. I feel quite perfect today.
Oh, interesting choice of words. We'll come to that shortly. I mean, one thing people need to understand about Fash, the $1 Million Fan, is he doesn't have much time for his fans, much less his colleagues on this show. He's got a very short window in his day, let's just say, to do these shows.
If you knew the time that we were recording, you'd be very proud of us. But I'm good, Wax. I'm looking forward to today's show. How about yourself? You're looking very green and mean today.
I am. Shame it's not a celebration week after the Cricket World Cup, which I'm sure everybody's very interested in. But it is what it is, Fash. Where are we in our timeline, Fash?
Well, this is it. So I'm going to rewind you back to 9 months ago when we were covering this period. It's very interesting. We were on the cusp of Survivior Series 1992. We were actually in November in our timeline, so we were ahead in terms of the 30 year gap. But because of the gap now, Wax, we're actually bang on where we were 30 years ago. So to remind everyone, in the previous episodes, and you can check them out in the archives, we have covered SummerSlam, and then we covered the debuts and departures post that. And then the biggest story which came, we covered the Ultimate Maniacs, and we covered the Ultimate Warrior's departure. So that Saturday night's main event, which essentially, from a television perspective, took place on the Saturday. Survivor Series is going to be on the Wednesday coming. And then you've got a primetime wrestling episode in the middle. Everything was taped. We explained the mechanics of it all in the archive, so please check that out. But yeah, we're basically at the eve of Survivor Series 1992. The main event is supposed to be the Ultimate Maniacs, Ultimate Warrior and Macho Man against Ric Flair and Ramon. This feud has been brewing for months, but the Warrior is no longer here. At the end of Saturday night's main event, in I guess an after recording, Vince McMahon and Bobby Heenan have the segment, and Bobby Heenan says one of the Ultimate Maniacs will not be at the Survivor Series. That throws it over to primetime wrestling on the Monday, and essentially WWF only has one show to salvage all this wax. So that's where we're at. One half of the main event isn't there anymore. The Ultimate Maniacs are finished. The Macho Man is left, and Vince McMahon's going to open this show, basically confirming what Bobby Heenan had, the carrot that he'd left everybody with at the end of that Saturday night's main event program.
Yeah, and before we kick off, Fash, on the actual show itself that we're covering, what were your general thoughts about Primetime as a wrestling show? It was one actually that I enjoyed a lot. I liked the whole sitting around the table discussing. It was kind of an early podcast, if you will.
It was very unique, and you know what it is? Going back to this timeline, didn't get to watch it as much. So as I've said many times, I would borrow any recordings from yourself and other people. And what I did, this is what I remembered Primetime as: the big kind of table, Vince McMahon heading it up, and he'd have a crew around him. They show matches, and there'd be some interviews and angles. But obviously, when you then later on watch older stuff, Primetime was actually synonymous with Gorilla Monsoon and Bobby the Brain Heenan. And then it evolved, and this was the last iteration of it with Vince McMahon. But yeah, it's a show that I'll still catch. I've watched this stuff on the network, tried to find it on YouTube. It was unique. And I think when you look at some of the storylines, the back and forth, it was very good for its time. And certainly this angle we're going to cover on it, I think still stands up so well today.
Yeah, I mean, why don't we kick off and just introducing the characters on the show? Vince obviously hosting this show. We've got and usually the way Primetime used to work is they used to have a couple of baby faces, a couple of heels on the show. Usually Bobby Heenan was always on it. Mr. Perfect was a regular as well. And then joining them was Hillbilly Jim and Hacksaw Jim Duggan. Any fond memories of Hillbilly Jim, Fash?
Growing up, not really. What I always thought about Hellbilly Jim was always odd. He'd seem to appear for a bit, be a part of a pay-per-view, and then he'd disappear. And then you realize later on he was on the kind of syndicated television, but he was never really part of a main storyline. But now when he came in early in 1985, he was Hulk Hogan's friend. He had a kind of push. I think he got injured then, and then after that, it was kind of stop-start with him. I guess his biggest moment might be WrestleMania 3, in the 6-man tag. But I don't really remember a lot of him wrestling. Like, maybe a pay-per-view here and there, Survivor Series 1988 pops up. But once again, it's retrospectively watching stuff.
Yeah.
But he was one of those guys where you always thought maybe that he'd left, but then you see him in an angle on prime time. But, I can't say he was one of my favorites or anything growing up. How about yourself?
No, I mean, the main thing I was going to say about that character is throughout the 80s and 90s, you couldn't really go far without seeing at least one hillbilly type character coming dressed in his dungarees
Vince
on a
McMahon and
wrestling show.
his likes,
Absolutely.
and then what about Hacksaw Jim Duggan?
I mean, Hacksaw, hopefully we'll get to talk a little bit more about over the shows that we're going to do over the next.
Yeah, because everybody knows you like a hoe. So, ultimately, what are your kind of memories of Hacksaw in this period?
Well, I think this actually is you. You like a big hoe, don't
Oh,
you?
don't do a comeback, which is
let's
piggyback you on my success.
Let's move on swiftly from that.
that was a good one.
But yeah, Hacksaw. I mean, I actually enjoyed Hacksaw as a character when I was younger. Now, when I look back, actually, I think this was one of the most ridiculous characters. Cheesy baby faces around. I think he had a couple of moments, and they'll come in the next year or so, maybe that really stood out to me. But generally, I was not. Now that I watch him, I'm not all that interested in watching his segments. Whereas back as a kid, who couldn't love that?
Yeah, and the 2x4. And the thing is, right, now going back watching Mid-South Wrestling, you actually see at one point he was more of a serious character, but Vince then turned him into a very one-dimensional character. But yeah, what's odd about this, I mean, going back to the topic, is if you're having a panel discussion, you don't really imagine Hacksaw Jim Duggan and Hillbilly Jim being, the two of the key components of it, but this is where we're at. But they're going to play an important role, during what's going to happen over the next, I guess, hour or so of this program and the storyline that they're going to weave.
Yeah, and how it all kicks off is very early on the show, they have Macho Man coming on, doing sort of a video interview, and Vince is asking him what he's going to do now that obviously his partner is out of commission altogether. And Macho Man said, he's got somebody in mind. He's got a guy who he wants to ask. And while he's talking, Bobby Heenan and Mr. Perfect in the background are just taking digs at him, having a laugh at his expense. But Macho Man goes, the person he's got in mind, he doesn't even like him, but he knows my opponents.
He says gut check time, doesn't it? And
knows my opponents better than I do. Heenan makes a couple of good jokes throughout this whole segment. And when he says he could be the perfect partner, everybody starts to play dumb. And it's like, we made reference to the word perfect so often in the last couple of shows. I think everybody understands what we mean, but somehow Hillbilly Jim and Hacksaw just couldn't get around
they're playing their characters well, though, because they are supposed to be a bit slow.
And even Vince is like, really? Surely you can't mean Mr. Perfect. And actually, that's exactly who Macho Man is referring to. And Mr. Perfect just bursts out laughing, as if, what a joke. And Bobby Heenan starts praising the attributes of Mr. Perfect, and then so does Macho Man. And Mr. Perfect doesn't really say much throughout the segment, but just sort of laughs at the whole notion that Macho Man came up with, and that sort of ends that first part.
Yeah, I think what I remember, I think from it was like, as you say, Vince McMahon playing a bit dumb, saying, "Do you mean?" Spit it out, and then he says, Mr. Perfect, and then what I recall is, I see Bobby Heenan, Mr. having a laugh. Bobby Heenan lifts his arm up and says, "We have a winner," and they're having a great time looking at the desperation of the match. When, as you say, that's the first break. They cut to a match, and that was the whole point angle and this. But we're on to something now, Wax. So the Warriors gone. Forget about that. They're trying to do something here, and something that you wouldn't have imagined at the time. Mr. Perfect has been called out by the Macho Man, and then we return from the match, and I think the next bit is that he gets a phone call.
Yep.
old school telephone. Vince McMahon passes on to the call for you, and Mr. Perfect does some okay level acting. Bobby Heenan, who's great, is basically saying, oh, it's Rick, essentially trying to speak to him as well, pass on my regards, all that kind of stuff. I'm paraphrasing. And then, Mr. Perfect puts the phone down, and everything seems to be okay between Bobby and Mr. Perfect at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those moments where I think they're trying to get us to think who's on that phone call. Although we're supposed to assume it's sort of Ric Flair calling Mr. Perfect to big him up. I think soon after, Hacksaw Jim Duggan is trying to add some insight to this whole debate about why couldn't it be Mr. Perfect, blah blah blah. But he fails, I think, in many respects to get his point across. And Vince sort of asks the question of Bobby Heenan, are you keeping Mr. Perfect on the sidelines here? And it's probably the first time that the Perfect sort of takes notice of the question and looks at Bobby Heenan. And I think, the star of this show has to be Bobby Heenan. He plays every part of his character to a T, and he comes up with this line saying he's just a manager.
That was it. That was the line, and
that
the way
was
they
a line that
was perfect.
Annoyed Mr. Perfect, but then immediately after saying that line, Bobby knows he said the wrong thing, and he starts to get nervous, starts to ramble a little bit, whereas Mr. Perfect sort of looks on, thoughtful at what's just been said.
Yeah, and that was it. You see, the MVP of this whole segment is Bobby the Brain Heenan. I mean, he's just brilliant. At one point he says something else and he gets nervous and he wants a drink of water, and the glass is empty and he says, "Give me some water." But yeah, he knows at this point when he says he's just a manager, and then he's backtracking, saying, "No, this is, everyone's got a role. I work for Rick, you work for me. Everyone's in a kind of a structure here. But of course you're perfect. Of course you're the best wrestler. Blah blah blah." But he knows at this point that he's screwed up and something might evolve from this.
Yeah. I mean, soon after that, obviously, with prime time, each time we have a wee segment, it's followed by a match. We're not going to talk about the matches at all. You know what? I can't even remember them despite watching the whole show. Heenan comes back after the break and saying Macho Man and Vince are doing this on purpose just to sow dissent. And I think, obviously, it's worth reminding everybody that this is a group that was formed initially with Bobby Heenan, Mr. Perfect, and Ric Flair. Very much for the last 12 months, they've been sort of hanging around together, causing havoc wherever they go. And Razor Ramon sort of joins that crew only recently when he sort of takes Macho Man Randy Savage out and causes them really to lose the title in doing so. So, there's a strong unit, and I think Bobby Heenan does a lot to mention just the success they've had as a unit over that sort of period. And we have then Ric Flair and Razor Ramon coming on screen, and maybe you can take it from there, Fash.
Like say, this is the unit I think from just before Survivor Series 1991, Mr. Perfect came into the mix. To remind everyone, his last match was against Bret Hart, SummerSlam 91. We've covered that in the archives, but he's got a back issue, and therefore this was the best way to use him as a commentator, and then actually expertly placing him with Ric Flair as executive consultant. But as you see, the next part of it is Ric Flair, Razor Ramon are now showing up. I think they're in Charlotte, North Carolina. I think they say that's where they are. And they're still looking very cocky and they're laughing it off. And what I'd say is we forget that though he'd been in the industry for a while and he'd been, in the AW, WCW, Razor Ramon looks like such a star here.
Yeah.
He's not high. This is going to be his first WWF main event, pay-per-view actually, but he just looks the part. And, he's kind of in the mumbling things, saying things. Ric Flair's kind of blowing it off. And I think at this point, Razor, as they're kind of having a back and forth, says, you used to be somebody. I heard you were somebody, used to be somebody. So these things, and you can see Bobby's reactions once again, kind of like, he didn't mean that. And, looking at Perfect and Perfect's reactions, which are very subtle. So, at this point, it still seems, there's a hierarchy. Ric Flair talks about how, him and Mr. Perfect are the best unit in professional wrestling. And, there's nothing to see here. But there's just those lines here and there, which once again, I see are putting those doubts into Mr. Perfect's head.
Yeah, and even though Ric Flair is very sort of magnanimous and says Mr. Perfect's a great guy, and he's really earned his keep as part of this unit, he does also say something along the lines of, we pay Mr. Perfect. He does what we want him to do. He walks behind Ric Flair, and this is just building up the thought process in Mr. Perfect's head, probably thinking, yes, I am part of this unit, and I do walk behind Ric Flair, but And then the big question gets asked of Mr. Perfect: is Ric Flair the better wrestler? Is Razor Ramon the better wrestler? And Heenan flat out says no. I am. I'm the better wrestler. And
Mr. Perfect
obviously,
says,
Mr. Perfect says, and it goes completely to his character that he would say something like that, because after all, he is perfect.
And then he says another line, doesn't he, that he could wrestle all three of them
Yeah.
in one night, and he could out wrestle the Macho Man, Ric Flair, and Razor Ramon. And then once again, Bobby Heenan's trying to pacify and say, well, he's got an ego, he's got pride. Ric Flair would be the same. But by saying that line now, then you see Ric Flair kind of scoff, and Razor Ramon doesn't look happy either. And he comes back with the line saying, like, wrestled in such a long time, and over a year. You've not had 3 matches in a year. You're talking about you're going to wrestle, three of us in one night. So, it's further. You see Ric Flair still being a bit diplomatic smart, but I like this because Razor Ramon is a new kind of brash, less refined character, and you see like he's being more disrespectful in the way he's talking, kind of screwing up the situation if you were to follow this angle from a prism of reality.
Yeah, and he plays his character to perfection again.
Yeah.
He's that very cocky, egomaniac type character, and he's happy to tell Mr. Perfect what he thinks of him.
And at this point, the Macho Man comes into it again as well. So the first time they've got Macho, I think he's in Sacramento, California, I want to say.
Yep.
You've got, Rick and Razor. You got Bobby and Perfect in the studio. Vince McMahon, I think, subtly is the other kind of MVP here, because he's the one that's really egging things on and going. But now you've got them all face to face, and that's where, Perfect's made the quip. But, Macho Man's really pushing them. Do you have the guts? Are you afraid?
Yeah.
Are you ready to be in the spotlight? Really pushing it from that side.
Yeah, interesting you mentioned Vince there. When I was watching, I thought it was actually Fash, the $1 Million Man, sitting there. $1
Million dollar
fan, but in this case, the $1 Million Man as well. But yeah, you're a mixer as well, aren't you, Fash?
Well, I like to get the truth out, Wax, and
the truth.
Get truth and put people in the spotlight as well. But Vince played his role perfectly, and obviously at this point, we don't know he's the owner of the company. We just know him as the good old announcer and host of Primetime Wrestling. But once again, he plays his role to perfection here. And you've got what I found funny about this new deal is you've got Hillbilly Jim, their Hacksaw Jim Duggan. But when Macho Man gets asked who you picking, he's not thinking about those two jobbers. He's thinking about the guy who's sitting on the other side, which makes sense from a storyline perspective.
Yeah.
But also, I thought it was a great kind of subtle thing that it's not either of you. But they're playing as they continue to push. They keep bringing up the point, Hillbilly Jim specifically, that you walking in the shadow. Are you just a manager? He keeps repeating that point. So everyone's kind of in their own way, just getting in the head of Mr. Perfect here.
Yeah, and at this point, actually, Mr. Perfect's not really said much throughout the whole show. It must be going on for an hour and a half, whatever the length of the show is, and he doesn't actually say much throughout the episode up till around now. When Macho Man asks, "Are you scared? Are you scared of Ric Flair? Are you scared of Razor Ramon?" And Perfect says adamantly that he's not. And Macho Man, this is where he's pushing him, right? Why don't you just consider it then? Why don't you just consider it? Pressuring him, and Mr. Perfect gets on his feet, and he's just at this point he's really riled, isn't he? He's just saying, "I'm not scared. I'm not scared. I will consider it." And that's when Bobby then loses it. Bobby then starts like grabbing him, saying, "You won't consider it. You won't consider it. There's nothing to consider." And they sort of start arguing and bickering, and that's when we sort of go off for another break.
Well, and with this, I think the Macho Man's really pushing it, because before this, Ric Flair's called Mr. Perfect kid. He says, this is just tell him, kid, this is just a bad joke and nothing wrong with being in my shadow, and, we're living the life, all that kind of stuff. But what I love is either it's before this break or after, the Macho Man ups the ante by calling Mr. Perfect a baby. Whether he's Ric Flair's baby, or if he's a man, and he really starts pushing this baby thing, for the next minute or so, to really rile up Mr. Perfect even more.
Well, it's interesting because the show started off really bigging up Mr. Perfect, but by this point he's getting it from both sides. Like Macho Man's calling him a scaredy cat, Razor Ramon's telling him to sit down and shut up,
and he used to be somebody.
Yeah, he used to be somebody, and he's not wrestled for a year, so just shut down, just shut up, basically, right? And this is really where I think Mr. Perfect comes into his own throughout the rest of the sort of segment, and he starts really, telling everybody what it is.
Yeah, and I think, we kind of take it a bit further. There's tension, and Bobby Heenan then pushes it a bit further, and he says, Vince McMahon's saying it's time to put up or shut up, right? Bobby Heenan's kind of saying, people in life have to take orders. and
it's
he's not wrestling
I was
anybody.
going to say that very quickly. The way they've presented it on screen just now at this point is like make a decision. It's like a game show almost. You got Macho Man on one side of the screen, you
Yeah,
got Razor and Rick on one side, and it's very much like a game show. Pick your side.
yeah.
Everybody's talking, everybody's shouting. Perfect, just sitting there, ready to make a decision.
Oh, well, that's it. And I think, rolling it forward, I say you've got this pressure. He's talking to him. And then, I think Mr. Perfect then just cracks. And he's kind of says he's sick and tired of everyone taking decisions for him.
Yeah.
And he kind of says, Savage, you want an answer? I'll give you an answer. I accept. And then what happens next, Wax?
Well, then it's Bobby Heenan and Mr. Perfect going at it, then aren't they? There's Bobby Heenan sort of loses it. I take orders from Flair, you take orders from Flair, and his tie's coming undone. And
well, that's it. But at this point, he gets up because Mr. Perfect's got up and said, I accept. But then at that point, Bobby Heenan gets up quickly and slaps Mr. Perfect across the face, and you're listening to me kind of thing. And that's the moment where there is no point of return.
Absolutely. And I think this is probably the most well done show of this type that I think I've ever seen. And I know, obviously, in the 2 hour, 3 hour shows that we get these days, very much the aim is to start off a storyline at the beginning and play it out towards the end. So I think Nitro was really good at it. They used to do it quite well in their heyday. But I think this was like the first time I'd seen something like this where there was a consistent storyline throughout a whole show.
Especially a show without a crowd, right?
Yeah.
Which is the biggest thing for me. And, like I say, the key bit is we've now got it. He's been pushed. He says he accepts. He gets slapped. He then grabs Bobby Heenan. Bobby Heenan's like, sorry, I didn't mean it. I'll do this. I'll buy you a car. I'll buy you a boat. I'll get on one knee. He gets on one knee. And, he's just basically embarrassing. And then, what Mr. Perfect does, obviously, nobody puts their hands on Mr. Perfect. And then he grabs a jug of water. And like I've done to you many times, Wax, over the years, he pours the jug of water all over Bobby Heenan. Once again, the reactions of Bobby Heenan are great. He doesn't break character. He's kind of like, he's like trying to speak while there's water coming. So he's kind of, as if he's, sinking. And at the same time, he's trying to kind of still pacify Mr. Perfect. And then Mr. Perfect calls him a wet weasel.
Yeah. And that word,
laughter, exactly.
Yeah, that word is going to stick with him for the rest of his career. That weasel.
Well, that's the thing, and it's been there actually, Wax. So I mean, to jump in there, the weasel thing had been dropped for a bit, but it goes back to his AWA days actually, and then the weasel suit match he had with the Warrior and others. But that's his thing. But to bring it back, and then you hear the laughter in the background, and you hear that famous Vince McMahon over the top laughter as well, which is what I noticed when I watched the angle again. That would become way more famous later on in parodies.
That was probably a real laugh because actually he probably enjoyed that moment more than anything else. That
he probably got shoot it a few times, probably. Knowing Vince, but it's just the point where that happens. The baby faces are cheering. Macho Man knows that he's got a partner, but they go to a break after that, and when they return, you've got Mr. Perfect just sitting there by himself. Bobby Heenan's gone, obviously trying to clean himself up, and then they throw it back to the Macho Man who now has the perfect partner.
Yep, and this is where sort of Ric Flair started losing it. And I think if you've ever seen Ric Flair's best promos on Saturday Night Live,
Saturday Night
Live. I was talking about the Saturday night show that he did with the NWA and JCP.
All right, okay.
But basically,
on TBS, the TBS show,
So this is where he starts taking his jacket off, gets into proper Ric Flair mode, standing at the camera, hands up, and just sort of shouting at the screen, telling Mr. Perfect that he's in for a world of trouble.
Well, that's he loosens his tie, doesn't he? But then he rips his shirt as well, and he starts off very calm, and then he's losing the plot. And then,
the amount of times I've seen Ric Flair undressed in a promo is incredible.
It's crazy, and then he didn't get to the point where he elbow dropped his jacket or anything because he was, that's later down the line. And then you've got Ramon with his kind of, anger and how he's going to, slap Mr. Perfect. And he says something like, go and find the last person that double crossed me.
Yeah.
But, I'm going to paraphrase it, but, if you can find him. And then Mr. Perfect kind of does, I'm so scared.
And actually, I think he's pretty comfortable with his decision at this point, Mr. Perfect. I think he's quite happy and he's relaxed and he's got a big cheeser on his face. He knows that the challenge is set for Flair and Ramon at this point.
And I think, the best thing here was something that we would have missed completely as kids, right? And we did, and others would have. That in this moment, to show how angry Ric Flair is, he calls him Henning. It was Henning. That's your real name, isn't it? Because you're not perfect anymore. And that would have went over the head of the audience that we were back then as
Yep.
8 and 7-year-olds. But that's just to bring the reality to it, that you're not perfect anymore. And basically, to do that, Mr. Perfect retorts by saying, well, if you take the Macho Man and Mr. Perfect, what do you get? And Razor Ramon says nothing much or not much in the background, which is a great line. You just hear it, not much. And he goes, you get the perfect team.
Yeah.
Which, there you go, is the moniker. And then I think he ends it with saying, the last thing you're going to hear at Survivor Series when he and the Macho Man are victorious is a big do your thing, Wax.
It's a big
woo! And he starts doing that. And that obviously just puts Ric Flair over the edge as they do this. And then I think, it ends with the famous pencil flick by Mr. Perfect. And then I think he does this kind of victory thing, and that's the end of the show. So I would just encourage everyone to go and watch this, because obviously we've tried to cover it in very quick form in the key beats, but a great angle.
Give me a rating, Fash, out of 10.
10.
10.
Given this a 10. Do you know why? Because for me, I was going to ask you this. I was gutted as you were a kid, the Warriors gone, right?
Yeah.
Such a big Warrior mark. But I remember going to school after that weekend, and somebody saying to me in the playground, because obviously I didn't have Sky, as I've said many times, that Warriors gone and Mr. Perfect's teaming up with the Macho Man. I was like,
why?
What do you mean? Yeah, exactly. Try and explain to me. And then I remember one of my mates said, I said, what's their name going to be then? And then he said, this is the mentality of 8-year-olds. He goes, well, they'll be the perfect maniacs. And at the time, I thought that was a great name. But obviously, they were the perfect team. But it was just, for me, has there been a better salvaging of a situation and a better angle where you just had a few days to turn something around and you actually end up doing something which worked from a storyline perspective and is still, watched today? I would argue that, of all the great moments Mr. Perfect had, that's certainly his most famous angle.
Mm-hmm.
He did all the vignettes, and then there was other things, the great matches, but this to me was masterful, how in just the space of a show without an audience, they played it, and I'm going to use the pun again, perfectly. For me, it was the perfect 10. What would you say, Max?
I absolutely agree. I think it was one of the best shows that I have ever watched then or now. I think it was it's always stayed with me, that this particular show, the way they played it out and the turn. And I think I think everybody deserves a round of applause basically on this show. They all did an excellent job, even though I've taken the mick out of Hillbilly Jim and Hacksaw. They did their part. They played it up perfectly. All round 10 out of 10, I think.
And that's it, because they're not playing off an audience either. So, this is all recorded. They're hoping, but, you can tell people at home are reacting to this, and they build it right up and they end it on a high note. And yes, like I said, this on TV, right? This is Monday. Survivor Series is 2 days down the line. They've had to go. Even now, when you look at posters for Survivor Series 92, most of them, barring I think the cassette which was eventually released, still has Warrior Macho Man on the cover. Very few had Perfect because it was so last minute. Obviously things were taped in advance, and we've discussed that. But to me, there's not been a better pivot. Now, another pivot is going to happen with the Warrior down the line, but I think this was the best one. A great babyface turn. I say everybody around it was just great at what they did. And you've got a main event that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So, Mr. Perfect now, last minute, he's going to be the partner. And you've just got a very compelling storyline going in, which, as much as you could, removes the issue you had with the Warrior going. We would have loved to have seen that main event, but if you could think of, the best outcome storyline wise, it's hard to find a better one. But with that, Wax, I think we both agree, right? This is one of the top angles. Would you say, I'm going as far as saying in modern wrestling, was that the best pivot they did from a situation that they had to fix in a very short period?
I certainly think so. I think sometimes, they have the odd debut here and there that really surprises you, really leaves its mark. And, those things sometimes come about because just last minute, everything sort of aligns. And I think actually Vince has always been at his best when the back's up against the wall. There's no time to overproduce something, no time to really think it out. Just go with the gut and, play a blinder. So I think definitely this, and the way that they then produced it and did it within the space of 24 hours, I think it is absolute perfection.
Yeah, and we keep saying the word perfection, perfect. We're using the puns, but not intentionally. It's just the way it was. So yeah, for me, if I'm just talking about storyline, which had to change very late in the day, I don't think there's been a better one. But what I wanted to ask you, Wax, to play a little bit of armchair booking. Mr. Perfect was able to do it, but as you say, he was injured over this period, right? And he was the executive consultant to Ric Flair. Say Mr. Perfect couldn't do it, he wasn't physically capable. Give me 1, 2, 3 names that could have been alternatives. So you're booking here, right? You can see the Survivor Series card. How do you fix this? Because what I'm going to say is the scenario I'll create is the main event is still the more important main event. Yes, you've got a title match, but this is the one that's been really promoted. How do you fix this? Who are the other people that potentially could have taken the spot?
Well, I honestly don't think there's anybody out there that could have filled the spot the way it is, just because of the way the story was built up to this point, with Perfect being part of the.
But see, you can't. So say we acknowledge that's ideal, but see, he just can't do it, right? And you've got to say a few days to sort it in terms of television. Give me some.
I'm going to give you 2 names, okay? And I think they're. I appreciate they probably don't fit, but I would have liked to see them there. One is Tatanka, and the reason for that is I would love to have seen the culture clash between Tatanka and Razor Ramon. And the second, actually, for similar reasons, I think Tito Santana could have done a job here as well. Oh my
God! And I'm just saying, I am so thankful that you're not a booker, because that is worse than Tony Khan. But
I mean, if you look at the
that's the best you got. So the Warrior, right, one of the biggest stars ever, is gone, and you replace them with Tito Santana or Tatanka.
You got to make new stars when a big star leaves. But the point I was going to make is the card. If you look at Survivor Series and the people that are on it, there's nobody really that stands out. I mean, maybe you
can you bring somebody from the outside last minute? Can you pick up the phone?
Yeah,
can you rejig something else?
There's your other options. Bringing somebody in from another company like WCW.
No, not a company. Somebody has to be available. I'm going to put you on the, put the pressure on here. This is not a Tony Khan where you're going to keep saying I'm not answering the question, right? So I'm going to
give you my answers.
The parameters. Your answer is so substandard that I'm disappointed.
I think they're pretty good. I think people would have loved to see one of these two guys step up to the main
I'm surprised you didn't say one name. I thought you would have said one name from a storyline logic perspective. And if you look at our recent shows, that would have fit in here, but you would have had to drop one of the other matches.
I don't know. The other one was I was going to say, maybe I'll steal your thunder. And actually, no, I'll let you go.
Well, I was thinking, I'm curious to see, because I'll give you a few names that I think, but who do you think I'm thinking?
The only other guy that I would have brought in at this stage, and then set yourself up for a long build to WrestleMania was Hulk Hogan.
That's an interesting one. So it's one of the names I was thinking, but obviously what we're saying is Hogan's away for a reason, right? Because of the whole steroid stuff. He will come back in February. There's not so. Really,
it was not planned.
The ultimate SOS call, right, to Hogan coming in. Hogan, basically, them coming together again. Mr. Perfect can't do it. Hogan and Savage. The mega powers against these two would have worked, but but it's difficult, right? Because there's still a lot of heat. He's not coming till the new year.
So realistically,
but realistic, I thought you would have said Bret Hart, because yes, Bret Hart's taking Shawn Michaels on, but if you think from Australian perspective, now he's not a bigger draw at this point. There's no way. I mean, I'm saying Warrior's difficult to challenge you, but he beat Flair for the title.
Yep.
So there's a storyline there at least. They don't need to do Shawn Michaels versus Bret Hart. That can happen, move it by a month or whatever. Michaels can defend the Intercontinental Championship against somebody else. But you could have done that as no one else works. We've got a champion. You lift him up. There's a belt storyline there as well, because he's taking the championship. So I think that's one. Hogan would have been, I say, the wild card like you. Roddy Piper, pick up the phone to him. He's not wrestling anymore, but he was at SummerSlam playing the bagpipes. A big name, you could do something. He had a feud with Flair, so that's being a little bit. And the last one, which wouldn't have happened, but would have got a huge pop, right? But you already had a storyline, and it would have been early. And the issue is, where do you take it next? Is The Undertaker?
Yeah.
So okay, that if they're really, can you imagine the reaction? Then you'd be like, oh my goodness. So those were names that came to mind. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm absolutely disgusted that you picked Tatanka.
They're two of my favorites, honestly.
Please,
92,
I'm gonna throw this
93.
out to the audience, right? I mean, Wax. This is a late recording, as you can tell. He's slurring his words and things, but I mean, that just tells you he's lost the plot when he's talking. I mean, Tito Santana said he was meant to be the champion at this point. It was him or Bret Hart. I mean,
Yeah, so there you go. That's how
your
that's how
comments
highly
even worse
thought.
than his.
That's how highly thought he
That,
was.
I
at this
mean,
time.
this is
I
just-
want everybody in the audience to just go back to 1992. You know, their 10, 12-year-old selves or whatever
I thought
they
you were
were.
going to say like Terminator. Everybody go back to 1982. Shoot you.
Absolutely.
So you can't make this
Come on.
comment 30 years
You've
later.
taken digs at my boy Tito Santana for ages, and actually, if you noticed, the green was
Well,
all
I
a
thought
plan.
that was going on.
After all,
This is all a storyline. The
guacamole
end is-
color.
Yeah, exactly.
supports
So you're
my
basically
boy
talking
Tito.
about it was all about Tito and Tatanka, but yeah, that would have bombed that idea of
That's
Wax,
true.
and this is why you don't book professionally. But that's the thing, isn't it? They went and got the person that fit in completely,
Yeah.
but you know, it's fun to kind of think about what could be and how you would shift the card elsewhere. But we are now, from a kind of TV perspective, Wax. We do have the person there. The Survivor Series took place on a Wednesday that year, so we've now got our main event. We've got the overall card. There's the World Championship match. Bret Hart will take on Shawn Michaels. So a very unique title match. It's so different from just rewind it to SummerSlam.
Mm-hmm.
The kind of main event. You've got take it to WrestleMania. This is two workers, two mid carders who are going to be taking each other on for the championship. One is the Intercontinental Champion, one is the World Champion. And now, okay, no more Ultimate Maniacs, but we have the perfect team. So there's some intrigue going in to the event. I obviously wish the Warrior hadn't gone away, but as we said, they did do a perfect pivot here. And just our discussion shows how difficult it would have been to place someone else in there.
Yeah, absolutely.
To take that spot, given it was the 11th hour. So no, it's a really fun angle. If you haven't checked it out, definitely find it on social media, online. You'll find it. If you haven't seen it in a number of years, go and check it out. As I say, it still holds well. It goes through the test of time.
It absolutely does, Fash. And next up, obviously, we have the Survivor Series 92 show coming up for our fans.
A pretty mediocre show overall, but as one that I remember really well. I actually remember the night very clearly that I watched it. It was post the event.
Strangely, I mean, I don't remember where I was and how I watched it, but I remember the matches, actually, a lot of them, and we'll talk a lot of them in a bit more detail on our next show.
Yeah, and this was a different Survivor Series because it was moving away from the formula of 4 teams of 5 or 4.
Which I hated. I mean, I hated the change because I hated the change. 4-on-4.
I hated the change as well, and this is why it was odd. But they had some gimmick matches in there. You had the first ever coffin match. You had a nightstick match. And you had a mix of other things going on. So yeah, it'll be good to kind of revisit that as well, given we are now going towards Survivor Series 2022 Wax. So we're right on there. So I think it's a very appropriate time to do that. And what I'm just thinking is I'm spitballing here, thinking our next show maybe in the middle or leading up to the actual this version of Survivor Series that we're going to see. Maybe you come up with, look across the years. Come up with what you think is the best Survivor Series team ever.
Yeah, that's a good show.
And I'll think about what I think it is well. So let's look at it from 87 all the way up to last year and pick our best team that really worked well together.
Sounds like a great idea, Fash. Unfortunately, I think we're gonna have to leave it there, Fash. I need to go pack my suitcase. I'm away on holiday over the weekend, so we might have
lack of professionalism.
Not at all. You'll hear plenty from me. I
hope another person, you always do these TikTok videos when somebody's attacking you, jumping you, you pay these people, so, if somebody else jumps you, I'm seeing it right now, it's got nothing to do with the $1 million fan. As I've said before, you've got one of those faces people just want to punch, be it in the UK or internationally. But safe travels, Wax, and, we will catch everyone soon. And the next episode, maybe you'll be in your holiday destination when we record that one. But it will be Survivor Series 1992, the review. We'll also, as I said in the middle, maybe try and get this other show before or after. A very quick one on what we think is the best Survivor Series team. But until next time, he's Wax. He's off on a plane. I'm Fash, and this has been Wrestling with Memories, the perfect show.